first of all, yeah, I mean, thanks for having me. It's been a little while since I've been here in Kyoto. A few weeks, Jason, maybe a couple months. Yeah, I'm here a bit. We have a lot of work ongoing with the School of Energy Science, as Professor Yanalov kindly introduced me. So today I'm going to get rid of whatever that message is there. Just going to kill that, if that's okay. All right, so today I'm going to talk about this achieving a just transition, energy system design and social equity. I just want to give a bit of a frame because I'm going to talk a little bit about research today, but I'm also going to talk a little bit about methods and some very basic theory as well. So I've kind of tried to pitch it so that students would be happy, but also researchers would be happy. So please bear with me as we go. All right. So the basic outline is I'll begin with the introduction of both of myself and the institute that I work at. I'll give some background to the problem, which I'm sure all of you are very, very aware of. And then I'm going to talk about two researchers. One is just transitions in Japan, and the other is social equity implications. Not in that order. Also, I've added some global work in because I thought I'd like to add some context at the global level as well. And then at the end, I'll just wrap up with a few recent things that we're doing in Japan that are pretty interesting. Okay, so as Professor Yalanov said, I'm an associate professor at the Institute for Carbon Neutral Energy Research, which is called ICNR at Kyushu University. Everyone can hear me okay? Great. And I teach in the Graduate School of Economics. So my specialty there is energy economics, no surprises. I think that would be fairly straightforward. Within ICNR, and I'll talk about this in a minute, I actually work in a department that focuses on energy analysis. So we analyze energy systems. But I think in my own research, energy system analysis, social equity, and energy economics, but I think maybe these three concepts will come up a lot today. Technology, systems, but most importantly, people. How do people choose the technologies that they want, and how do they get incorporated into energy systems? In terms of ICNR, we're here at the top of Kyushu Island in Fukuoka. I welcome everyone to come and visit at any time. And ICNR actually has three divisions. The one that I work in is called Multi-Scale Science and Engineering for Energy and the Environment. So that's everything from CO2 separation membranes through to energy analysis and social equity. So it's quite broad from the basic sciences right through to social engineering. Advanced energy materials, which mostly focuses on the new austenitic stainless steels and infrastructure for the common hydrogen economy. And the third one is advanced energy conversion systems, which looks at converting alcohols, CO2, these kind of things to useful fuels. So hydrogen and ammonia come into that, CO2 to ethanol or ethylene, these kind of pathways, they work there. So let's start with a little bit of background. So as we all know, Japan is undergoing an energy transition. But a lot of you probably remember this guy. He was the prime minister a couple of years ago, and he went on TV and he said, Japan is going to be virtually carbon-free by 2050. He used these very strange words, virtually. It means there'll be some above the line and some below the line. So some negative carbon, some positive carbon, and we'll end up at carbon neutral. That's the idea. And the energy transition is proceeding quite well, I think, especially in terms of the 2030 goals, which are fairly achievable in terms of renewable energy deployment. Not so clear for 2050. We don't exactly know how we're going to get to zero, but there's a fair amount of enthusiasm. And also this guy, he was recently elected in the US, and he's a little bit different to the previous guy who said, we're not going to do carbon neutrality and we're not going to join the Paris Agreement. So America in 2021 said, we're coming back to the Paris Accords. This is also the picture that we show when we show virtually zero CO2. So think about, oh, this is us now. We live these convenient lifestyles using lots of carbon. In the future, we'll live convenient lifestyles using very little carbon. But to make these things, there will be some carbon. So some of it will have to go under the ground. Some of it will have to convert it to fuels. That's what that virtually zero means. Some above the line, some below the line. So energy transition is happening in Japan. And there's this theoretical approach to energy transition. If you read enough energy transition theoretical papers, you'll end up seeing this guy, Kuke, who says, well, an energy transition is a shift from whatever you have today to something new. And it should be a complete change. But he gives this kind of 80%. So if 80% of the energy at the moment is coming from fossil fuels and that changes to renewables, or renewables and nuclear, or renewables and CCS, some combination, then that could be okay. The other thing that could be successful is if you exhaust all of the possible deployment. So if you deploy the maximum amount of renewable energy, for example, that's also considered to be an energy transition. So clearly we need to find this sustainable portfolio, and clearly there's also no single solution, but we think probably renewables and hydrogen to a degree will play a big role in Japan. So one example of an energy transition is the renewable energy transition, and that would look something like this: fossil fuels to renewables. I think that's the pathway we're probably on in Japan. But it's not the only pathway for an energy transition. You could have a low carbon energy transition where you stop using fossil fuels and use nuclear and carbon capture and storage. That would also be fine. That would achieve the goal of a low carbon energy transition. There's no rules. Another option for an energy transition is we all just stop using energy tomorrow, achieve carbon neutrality, and live like cavemen. That's also okay. Not the option that we would choose, but it is an option. So we can see there's lots of options for this, but what if we want to not just achieve an energy transition, but what if we want it to be a fair or a just transition? So thinking about the term just transition, where does it come from? If you work in the social sciences and you worry about things like employment impacts, you've probably heard the term before. It actually came from the union movement. And what the unions were concerned about was if, for example, in a transition, we moved from, steam locomotives to electric trains, would people lose their jobs? Could the people in the old industry be transferred easily to the new industry? There was a lot of thought about these kind of things. So they wanted to protect jobs in a changing market. That was the initial idea behind a just transition. But as the energy transition became a thing, and we started to think about what is important in terms of energy, and the aspects of energy justice came to light, that idea has kind of grown up. It's matured over time. And so this European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, I was having a chat to Professor Janosov before the presentation, a place that probably wouldn't really be interested in these things, generally speaking, has even defined it, not a scientist, not someone trying to publish a paper, but just an abstract place. And they said a just transition seeks to ensure that the substantial benefits of a green economy transition are shared widely, while also supporting those who stand to lose economically, be they countries, regions, industries, communities, workers, or consumers. So what they're kind of saying is, yes, jobs are really important. We need to keep those, but also whatever good things or bad things come out of this transition, they should be shared in a fair way. And that has a really close association with social equity, which I'm very interested in. So let's go back to some theory about energy transition. Just a show of hands, how many people here, you know what an energy transition is? You're comfortable with the theory? You know what the multi-perspective viewpoint is? Yeah, that's what I thought. A few people would know about these things. It's, unless you look at it, it's not something that's common, and that's completely okay. But I think the concept is friendly enough that we can put it in context with other transitions. So here are some examples of historical energy transitions. There is a point to this. Trust me, there is a point to this. So think about the Industrial Revolution. England is a great example. People used biomass to warm their homes. So wood, these kind of things, they would burn in their homes to make their houses warm. And then they get to a point where industry is getting to a point where burning wood is not hot enough to make the products that they want. So steel making was the issue. And so they shifted from biomass, wood, to coal. And the reason was that they wanted to use coal to make steel for transportation and other critical sectors. And there was a reason. There always has to be a reason for an energy transition. And the reason was they needed a more efficient way to make better steel. Another example very close to our lifestyles and something we take absolutely for granted these days is lighting. What is our most common light source? So think back to 100 years ago, people were using candles. And even today, you can use a candle to read a book. That's completely okay. But you wouldn't choose a candle as your first option, right? Because we've got beautiful LED lights that we can flick on and they provide a non-dangerous, clean source of lighting. So this transition also took a long time to occur. Went from candlelight to gas lighting through to what we have today. And it also made other things happen, like, for example, the deployment of gas pipelines, and it led to electrification. But the main reason was increased convenience. It's not necessarily more efficient, doesn't necessarily make you feel better, doesn't change the activity itself. You're still reading a book. But it's much more convenient to not have to buy or make candles every time you want to read a book, right? So there's a different reason. There are some more examples of historic energy transitions or historical transitions. Transport and delivery began with canals. In the UK, I found the other day that in the UK, they're now retrofitting canals so that people can hire boats just to travel around the UK as a fun thing, because they no longer use them to transport things because it's not efficient. So from canals to railways to roads to aircraft, all of these transitions take a little bit of time. And there's lots of reasons: increased convenience, speed, and of course, cost reductions. But we also note that each of these transitions, these S-curves are the periods, they last between 20 and 50 years. One more example, and I think this is also important, and it's very relevant to climate change too. Think about wartime. What happens in wartime? Think about World War II. In the US, for example, I think these pictures are probably from the US, they might be from the UK. All of a sudden, factories that used to make cars, so think Fiat, Renault, Ford, they began making army tanks. Now, that's not in their interest economically, I mean, apart from the government funds and those kind of things, but it's not a long-time business plan, right? Local workshops, local welders were building, casing some missiles or, bullet shell casings, these kind of things, quite common. So why would they do it? It wasn't increased convenience. It wasn't because it made them feel better. It wasn't those things. It was because there was an urgency. They wanted to win the war. So they're urgent about it. And I think this has some linkage to climate change now. If we think it's urgent, maybe we'll do something about it. But if we don't think it's urgent, then maybe we won't. So the main point of all this is we need a reason for success. Energy transition, there has to be some logical reason for why they would be successful or otherwise. Some examples of those reasons, as we went through: efficiency, urgency, convenience, cost reduction, they're all fine. So the question then is, why would we choose a renewable energy transition? Now, that's not a hard question, right? We can understand why we would choose a renewable. We have cleaner air, we have perhaps over time cheaper energy. There are lots of things that we might foresee through a renewable energy transition. What about a just transition? Why would we choose to have a fair energy transition? So that's just another question that I want to put out there. A little bit more theory. Again, I noticed that 2 or 3 people in the crowd were familiar with energy transition, so I think this is useful. There were some people, I want to say 20 years ago, but it might actually be 30, who were really the pioneers of this energy transition theory. And if you see those named there, Giels and Lebon are names that come up quite often. They developed a tool called the multi-perspective transition framework. And all it does just gives us a nice, like a Google Maps view of what does a transition look like. That's the general idea. And it's useful to help us to understand why transitions occur, but also linking back to those reasons or the rationale for why we might want them. And there's 3 aspects. You can see them down the bottom. The first one is exogenous impacts. So exactly as it sounds, things completely outside our control, things that just happen that influence us to act in one way or another. The second part of the viewpoint is called the socio-technical regime. That's us, the actors within the regime. So it's the pathway for the transition influenced by social and technological aspects. So technology development, political happenings, people's opinions, these kind of things. The third one is niche innovations. This is the one I think that most people think drives energy transitions. Young, immature technologies get so good that they penetrate the market and therefore change the world. It's not actually true, but that's what we think. So hydrogen might be one of these, solar panels might be one of these, wind turbines might be one of these, and they boil up and they eventually become like the dominant technology in society. So think fossil fuel, thermal power plants for today. What's the thing that's going to replace those completely? It's probably not a single technology, just as a hint. It's probably a group of technologies. So the multi-perspective framework looks something like this. Now, I'm not going to describe it like this because it's ugly like this. There's too much information. But the 3 aspects that I talked about, so the exogenous context, us in the socio-technical regime, and then these niche innovations, they're all actually linked together because they do different things. So the exogenous impacts put pressure on our lives, and the niche innovations hopefully penetrate the market and end up in the future energy system. So if hydrogen is the best option, then it should be here in the future, right? If it's not, it should lose to something that is superior. That's the theory. Theory doesn't mean that it always works this way, but this is the theory that they propose. So breaking down those three layers, the first one, exogenous impacts. I think it's true that they can deeply influence energy transitions. And I want to talk in context of Japan because that's where we are. Think back to 1997. The Kyoto Protocol, signed here in Japan, kind of spurred this social consciousness about there's an issue. we need to fix. We need to reduce carbon over time. We need to be conscious of climate change. So even when I was quite young, and maybe some of you weren't even born, this was happening. And then zoom forward to 2011, what happened in Fukushima, right? Massive nuclear disaster. In about a week later, nuclear generation in Japan was at zero, from 20% to zero. That's a radical change. So something beyond our control completely changed the energy system. And not only did it completely change the energy system, it gave us an opportunity to change the energy system to something else. Now, we didn't, but we could have. We could have. It changed a little bit, but not as much as people predicted. More recently, the Paris agreements, again, these globalized climate issues and make countries commit to action. Now, a lot of countries are waiting for other countries to act first, so it's not always altruistic, but that's what happens. And then most recently, as I started this presentation with 2 years ago in Japan, we're going to be carbon neutral. Why is Japan saying that? They're saying it because America said it. They're saying it because people in Europe said it. There's this domino effect, right? These are what I would think are the exogenous impacts. The most important part of it all is obviously the bit that we live in, okay? Exogenous impacts are beyond our control. As people, we don't have a lot of influence on them. So I think that the socio-technical realm is the most critical to understand. So as you can see, there's all these actors here. There's policy, there's science and technology, there's industry, there's markets, acceptance, culture, our own preferences, things like that. And we know that policy and technology are important because that's what we're told. We're told that governments make policy and that changes the energy system and then everything works out. It's not exactly how it works. I think this part is maybe what I want you to take home today, is that we the people, our culture, our preferences actually help to either speed up or slow down the energy transition. Policy in a vacuum is fine, but unless people find the combination of technologies acceptable, they won't invest in them. They won't support them. There'll be some reaction to that role. And in Japan, these orange points, they're not important. It just talks about market transitions. But every 2 or 3 years it's updated. There's what's called a strategic energy plan. And that tends to detail what the government thinks a good balance of technologies might be. And then they seek public comment and industry investment on those. Finally, the niche innovations. I'd like you to imagine each of these arrows as an individual technology or a group of technologies. And in this theory, the technologies are seeking to win. They want to be the best, the most acceptable, or the cheapest, or the most efficient. And that's why we fight with these things. Should it be the cheapest one? Should it be the most efficient one? Should it be the one, especially for Japan, with these geographic issues about deploying renewables and so on? Should it be the one that can overcome those? I think this is probably a good place to start, a good group of technologies. I think specifically for the renewable energy transition, rather than like for fossil fuels, we need an intermediate set of technologies. So we need to store some of the energy. We need to distribute some of the energy. So maybe a good group of technologies. Or, looking for the bigger picture, should it be technologies that actually improve the likely occurrence of a just transition? These are very big questions. I'm not going to answer these today, but I'd certainly like you to think about them. And I know that industry and governments think about them because they all want to know, what is this combination going to be for 2050? Because that enables early investment decisions. It enables learning curves to proceed in the right directions and all of these kind of things. So now we know how and potentially why energy transitions progress. So our big question for today is, what would it take to engender a just transition in Japan, and how do people's preferences, understanding our personal situation, our lifestyle, affect their feelings toward the transition? How do they either invest in it or not invest in it? And I don't want to describe that in terms of theory. I'd like to describe it in terms of some recent research. So Japan's pretty interesting in terms of the energy transition, because it's not really like Europe and it's not really like America in any ways that I can think of. For example, in the US, there's a big, massively interconnected network. In Europe, there's a multinational electricity network. You can rely on a number of nations' properties to decide what the future is going to look like. But Japan has none of these things. No limited natural resources, no neighbors, no interconnected networks. You know, they must do it on their own. I think one thing that's very unclear is nuclear energy. Interesting factoid. If you plot the Japanese election cycle, so closer to election, further from election, close to election, further, you'll find that nuclear goes up and down, almost perfectly in line with this. So as we get further and further from election, the amount of nuclear in the energy mix goes up. As we get closer to the election, it goes down. The idea is that they're seeking people's support, right? So by the time people have forgotten who they chose, it's time to put the nuclear back up again, because those are stranded assets. We need to do those things. But I think in Japan, this conversation is still open. I think most recently I've heard as high as 20% could be derived from nuclear in the coming years. And I think logically, at least pragmatically, forgetting about our own opinions, it makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of nuclear infrastructure in Japan. Whether we want it or not is a completely different conversation. Obviously, carbon neutrality is the ultimate goal. And so the final question is, what about the people? And that's what we're going to talk about today. So one of the things that we did, and Jason up the back there was actually a member of this research, so maybe it's not so exciting for him, but that's okay. It might be exciting for everybody else. We collaborated with the Open University in the UK and Kyoto University here, and under the British Academy of Sciences, they asked us to investigate the just transition in Japan. And so we did that through a number of ways. We did some workshops, we did a nationwide survey, we visited some cities, which I'll show you at the end of the presentation. But I want to share with you some of the outcomes of the survey, because I think you might find some of these things surprising, but I also think you might find some of the outcomes quite logical, and they might align with your own values or not. And I think that's important. So our surveys look at people's knowledge of energy technology and policy, important energy and environmental issues, the energy mix, and of course, issues related to the energy transition. Our survey was a nationally representative sample with 6,000 respondents, adults 20 to 90 years of age from all 47 prefectures. There's a reason this number is 6,000. For any of you that do statistics or look at comparing prefectures in Japan, you need 6,000 distributed according to population to get significant comparable prefectures. That's kind of the magic number. Ideally, it's about 6,300, but that's not always how survey companies work. But this allows us to say, yep, there is a significant difference between, say, Kyoto and Wakayama, for example. You can make these kind of assumptions. Without that number, it's pretty hard statistically to achieve that. All right, so what do we find? I'm from Australia originally, so some of these things were interesting for me. Maybe compared with your own home country, they might be interesting. The average age of respondents in Japan, an old country, was approximately 50, and most people had lived in their current prefecture for about 30 years. So you would think they would be fairly interested in their prefecture's future and their prefecture's, longevity, those kind of things. Most people lived in detached houses, that's okay, and the majority of them were full-time employed. As you can see, full-time, part-time students, etc., etc. And most of them, or about half, had a bachelor's degree, but above that is not so high. And I think that links quite nicely with the average age. This slide, if you remember one thing today, or the second thing I'd like you to remember is this thing. Most people in Japan didn't know what a just transition is. Now, I think if we asked this question in Europe, especially Northern Europe or Western Europe, we would get a much higher response rate. I think if we asked it in the US, we'd probably get 20 or 30%, especially younger people you would think would know this. 3.8% of people either knew it or knew it well. A further 16%, for a grand total of 20-ish, had heard of it. They'd heard the words before, on the news or via the internet. So immediately we've got this huge problem. We want to find out how Japanese people's preferences affect their, knowledge or understanding or desire for a just transition. No one even knows what the hell it is. So immediately have this big problem. But we go on. The other thing, this is coming back to those statistical issues that I talked about, why we need 6,000 samples. We did find that there is a distinct difference between both regions and prefectures in their level of knowledge of a just transition. So on the left-hand side here, we have the regional difference. So you see that the Kansai region is relatively high, whereas the Chugoku region is relatively low. That's okay. That's not interesting or not. But here, where we layer the regions from north to south, so this would be Okinawa and this would be Hokkaido, these regions are then reflected here. So you can see in the Tohoku region, Fukushima's people's level of knowledge of the just transition are much higher than their peers, so the people around them. Now, I think I could ask any one of you why that would be, and you would give me the correct answer, right? So we won't talk about that. Obviously, the issues of 2011 has starkly put an energy transition in these people's minds, and I think that's borne out by a result. So why is Wakayama so high compared to its friends in the Kinki region? I can't give you a definitive answer, But around the time that we took this survey, there was an SDGs convention being held in the Kinki region. And so there may have been a lot of news or media attention on this issue that made people aware of that issue in particular. We don't know if that's exactly the case, but Wakayama did host one of these relatively large multinational gatherings for that. I don't think it's convincing. I think this one is a lot more convincing because the level of the others is fairly consistent, whereas we see quite a bit of variation here. But it's interesting nonetheless. In terms of knowledge, don't worry so much about the slides. I summarized them on the left-hand side. We basically asked people how well do they know different energy generation technologies. And of course, established renewable energy types were much better known than emerging ones. So people were much more confident that they knew about solar and wind and things like this rather than carbon capture and storage or biomass energy with carbon capture and storage. And unfortunately, also hydrogen as well wasn't so well known compared to these. So that's another challenge that we have. For policy, people were well aware of the SDGs. I think everywhere we go these days in Japan, SDGs. You go to the supermarket, SDGs. You go to the bank, it's SDGs, right? So I think it's in people's minds. It's everywhere. The Kyoto Protocol was very well known, and the Paris Agreement was very well known. Apart from that, though, things like state-level renewable portfolios or INDCs were not so well known. In terms of people's preferences, so what they want to see in their future energy system, environmental protection and a safe energy system were most important, but unfortunately for me, social equity was considered less important overall, along with a convenient lifestyle. I'll come back to this a little bit later. I won't dwell on it for now. In terms of people's preferences, we asked people whose opinion they should consider when we move away from fossil fuels, and they said, well, us, so research institutes, think tanks, but also home energy users. So I think that really reflects then back on who should we listen to towards an energy transition. It is just the everyday people. In terms of whose profit we should prioritize, the biggest response was no one's. So I think that would align with some people's values. But second to that, the next biggest was actually energy consumers and the public. Which socioeconomic groups should we prioritize? Even though people said social equity is not important, they said that low-income groups and child rearing groups should be prioritized. So clearly there's some thought about social equity, even if it's using different words. And which generation should we prioritize? The children and current generation, far away the best in that respect. In terms of trade-offs, how should we pay for all of this recovered from tax? Actually really interesting because in Japan at the moment, we recover the cost of renewable energy through energy bills, a surcharge on energy bills, which is very similar to a everyone pays tax, right? So I think people are generally maybe not unhappy with the amount, but that method seems to be okay. Acceptable job losses, nuclear and resource extraction. People thought they were acceptable job losses if we were going to transition to something else. Personal actions, people were quite happy to install PV or increase the amount of renewable energy in their energy plan. And the other one was acceptable local and state level actions. I won't go through them individually because they're just about installing different energy types. But the question was, we said, would you be happy to install it in your town? One question. And would you be happy to install it in your state? And in every situation, it was always at the state level. So this idea of I want it, but I don't want it close to me is common throughout all energy deployment. And that was borne out quite well here. In terms of people's preferences, we found that they wanted improved health, reduced natural disasters, and lower energy costs. So again, there are some contrasts and some conflicts in their responses. But also, and I think far and away, if we're going to talk about social equity, people also wanted to maintain their current lifestyle. And so they really don't want a reduced quality of life or more expensive energy. So there's got to be some trade-offs there too. So in summary, people just aren't aware of what a just transition is. That was one of our big findings. That was quite disappointing. Obviously, we need to educate if we're going to make policies that align with people's values. If they don't know what those values are, that's important. And we think maybe the reason is that the current hot topic on TV that everyone knows about in Japan is carbon neutrality. It's talked about every day, every week on the news or in those sort of chat programs. But we have some evidence that this idea of a just transition will come up. Again, highly related to social equity. One example, if you've got some time to have a look at a later date, is Japan for some time has been talking about Society 5.0. Who's heard of Society 5.0 in Japan? Okay, so almost as bad as the energy transition theory. Look it up. It talks about an aging, shrinking Japan and how they're going to deal with it through technology, through balancing economic and environmental outcomes, things like that. And it really starts to sound like social equity and energy justice. But it's not a popular catchphrase in Japan at the moment. So maybe we're going to have to wait until the next one comes along. But this might be it, we hope. So, social equity, hopefully the main point of what I'm going to talk about today. We know that preferences, culture, and behavior can affect an energy transition, but what is it that drives our preferences? Why do we have these preferences? Now, according to some of the responses I've showed today, and some of the things that I'll talk about in the other survey results that I'll share with you, is that it's likely that these are driven by the factors which we value toward our own quality of life. And I think that's economically rational. Economic rational theory states that people are generally greedy, or they act in their own interest first. And that's human nature. That's completely fine. We buy the car that we can afford. We work so that we can have the money that we need for our lifestyle. These are quite common things. And it seems like that's the same in terms of our preferences toward the energy system. So, social equity, how do we actually find what people's preferences are? Well, we ask them. That's the simple answer to the question. And that means nationally representative surveys. Again, you'll see this magic number of about 6,000. This is something that we deal with in Japan. Different nations, different regions, those numbers will change. But in terms of social equity or future environmental preferences, people said they want to reduce greenhouse gases. They want to reduce PM 2.5. PM 2.5 is actually very well known in Japan. Does everyone know what PM 2.5 is? Okay, a little less than I thought. It's particulate matter, and it's the fine particles that go in the air because of industrial action, things like that. When we talk about it in context of our research, PM 2.5 is the one thing that if we breathe in, it has directly measurable health impacts, morbidity impacts, lungs, blood vessels, these kind of things. So it's a really good proxy for health. In addition, preserving water, reducing waste, and some really good recognition here, the necessity for rare materials in order to have, life's convenience, mobile phones, all those kind of, everything, your computers, everything you have. If we're going to then measure them and try and work out how to do them, we could also reflect them as footprints. So again, carbon, air pollution, water, waste, rare materials, they would link quite nicely to these. And I'll show you some research associated with those in a minute. Before I do that, I'll just summarize some other stuff. The other thing that we need to be aware of, and again, this is about significant differences between states and prefectures, is sometimes how we're affected by something is actually just based on where we are, our location, economic and environmental factors. This result from some of our research shows where should you put mega solar if you want the fairest distribution or just the most number of jobs and the most greenhouse gas. So efficiency versus equity. Red is equity and blue is efficiency. But you'll see it's different even within the same states. The point is different states have different levels of irradiation. They have different tax regimes. They have different available land. There's all of these factors that influence these things. So even just the deployment of mega solar can affect people's quality of life depending on where they live. Obviously, you wouldn't deploy solar in a place that had limited sunlight and 3 months of snow per year. That wouldn't necessarily improve people's lives if they wanted to reduce greenhouse gases, for example. Also, if we apply our preferences to a future energy system, not only can they change things like how much CO2 reduce or how many jobs we create, they can impact those outcomes and the speed of the achievement of goals. I think one of the things that comes up consistently in our research, and I hope that some of the examples that I give, is that education and knowledge of the potential trade-offs is super important. Is it going to cost more money to reduce greenhouse gases? Is it going to take a long time to deploy? There are always trade-offs in things. Who is going to lose their jobs? Who is going to gain the benefits? Our most recent research shows that it's actually possible to measure people's preferences. So when I ask someone in a survey, no one's listening. They can answer whatever they think. They can answer, the most altruistic, most positive thing that they could think of. Oh, yes, I want a better environment. Oh, yes, I want cheaper energy. Oh, yes, I want poor people to have benefits. But then maybe their actions actually are slightly different to what they desire. And so finding out what the gap is between those two things is firstly really important, but then trying to align those two things is also good, because if someone says, I want this, but I'm acting like this, then we can say, well, you need to just change your behavior by this much to get the future that you want. So it's those kind of hints that we're looking for. I do now want to talk about that research because I think it's pretty interesting. We know that people's consumption can lead to environmental inequality. Think about it. The higher your income, these are national incomes, these are personal incomes. The higher your income, generally, the more you consume. So therefore, the amount of CO2 that's emitted to the environment as a result is higher. I don't think that's bad. I think that's just logical, right? If you this much money and this much spending, this much CO2, that's okay. The problem is the CO2 that's emitted by these high income groups, or the consumption issues or the cost impacts or the job impacts, aren't felt by these people, they're felt by these people. So it's the distribution of the costs and benefits that are unequal, and that's what causes a shift in society. And obviously, even the UN has said we want to alleviate environmental pressures, but we also want to alleviate inequalities. So the idea is if we're going to achieve a more socially equitable outcome, we need to consider people's environmental preferences in line with these, environmental justice or social equity ideals. So now I'm going to say some quite normal things and some maybe radical things, but hopefully I will spur your thinking. It may be reasonable to then say that if people's preferences can be aligned with their actions, that we can begin to measure both environmental and social equity outcomes. And I'll show you how in a minute. First, I want to show you those 5 footprints that people said were the most important to them in their future action. This is carbon, air pollution, PM2.5, water, rare materials, and waste. And as you can see, we projected, these are the real numbers, and then from 2015 on, they're projected based on consumption patterns and population shifts. And the point is Japan is shrinking and getting older, right? So we know that overall the amount of these footprints is going to go down because there will be less people, there will be less consumption. But we also know that different income groups from low to high here will impact on how they do it based on the National Consumption Survey of Japan. So you'll see the different peaks that we expect to see. And here we go, as Japan ages and shrinks, people's impact on the environment will change. And that's important. So then the next what if question I want to ask is, what if we aligned people's identified preferences, i.e. what they told us in a survey, to their future behavior? I don't think this is too radical. I'll give 2 examples here. The first one is greenhouse gases, carbon reduction. The red dotted line is the average response in the survey by income group. There are 3 income groups that are slightly higher than the average, which says that they're slightly more concerned about that issue than the average person. So we might say that they would be slightly more likely to modify their behavior to reduce carbon. I'm talking about really simple actions. I'm talking about going to the supermarket and not asking for a plastic bag. I'm talking about riding your bicycle instead of driving your car for a very short trip. Very achievable, very easy things that people who were environmentally conscious to begin with could do. Simple stuff. And then we take water as a different example. So here you can see the average response for water is the red dotted line again, and almost all income groups, except for the higher income group, are super aware of water. They really want clean water. They really want available water, even though in Japan, I find it mind-boggling. In my home country of Australia, Greg will know this, water hasn't been invented yet. We don't have any of it. It never rains and there's no rivers, and yet people in Japan, water is everywhere. They really love the stuff. But what if we said these people who are way more, than the average, what if they were willing to do a little bit more? So something a little bit more radical than say, I don't need a plastic bag. What about having shorter showers? What about not watering the garden and having a dry garden? These things that take a little bit more effort, a little bit more input. Then maybe they would be willing to be a little bit more aggressive towards those reduction actions, and their footprints would shrink even more in line with their behaviors, if we could encourage them to do so. So by quantifying these potential behavior adjustments over time, and by accounting for the changing demographics in Japan, we can start to begin these quantitative social equity outcomes. And the social equity framework I'll show you here, hopefully you've got, these 2 papers have been available to you for the last few days. So maybe some of you have had a bit of a read. Some of you looked at the methodology. It looks a bit like this. In this case, we use consumption and we stack footprints by income group. Then we use an area-weighted centroid to derive who is making the problems and who is bearing the impacts of those problems, and then overall how people's quality of life changes. We use different axes to achieve these things. Back to our what if question. Depending how active people are towards their preferences. So these are already things that they want to potentially do. We haven't said, you must do these things, or we're not changed the law, we haven't enacted a policy, but we might encourage them. For example, when you go to the supermarket, if you want a plastic bag, it will cost 5 yen. No, I don't want to pay 5 yen, so I'm encouraged to not take one. Something as simple as that. We're not talking about rule making, we're not talking about forcing people, just encouraging them to already act along their own preferences. If they then reduce their footprints, so for example, those people that did the minor actions are here, the people who did the major actions are here, this is business as usual. So this is growing Japan, this is shrinking Japan. So we already know that just because people's consumption will reduce, that the environmental impacts will then reduce, and therefore social equity is slightly improved. This scale is inequity, so lower is better. It's a little bit confusing. But by actually actively reducing their footprints, social equity, quality of life, basically, is also improved. So this is a really neat finding. We can improve people's quality of life just by encouraging them to act in the way that they probably already want to act. The second part of social equity that we measure, as I said before, is the allocation of burdens. Who pays for what? The reason for this is very simple. If you think about really poor people and really rich people, if poor people pay for the bad things, society goes like this. If rich people, also those with economic means, pay their fair share, society goes like this. And this is what we want to achieve. We want to shrink the gap between rich and poor. So we want to shift the burden towards those who do the consuming. We don't just want rich people to pay because they've got money. We want rich people to pay because they do the consuming. It's linked to actual behavior. And ideally, we want the burden to shift above this zero line so that the gap gets smaller. It doesn't happen. Sure, it gets better over time. You can see the active and proactive scenarios actually increase it towards this magical balance line, but it makes the constantly expanding gap between rich and poor less bad. It's not a perfect solution, but it does have an impact, and it does have a positive impact. The really interesting thing about this research is that we can actually drill down to individual products that people consume in Japan, and which of these products increased or decreased consumption will change quality of life or the burden allocation. So you can see I've got some examples here: passenger cars, gasoline, all of these things. But what's really interesting is actually here that I don't have labeled. In Japan, people are getting older. And when people get older, they need specific services. And one of those is medical services. And the reason this is critical for consumption is that it relies heavily on rare materials. Some of the people are very concerned about CT scanners, MRIs, all of these kind of treatments require a lot of these things. And it's these ones here that refer to those medical services and supplies. And so for Japan, this is going to be an issue. And if we're already aware of it, we can start to think about how we're going to, prioritize avoiding certain times of consumption so that we can allow for the consumption of others while not disrupting qualities of life. The second and final research I'd like to share, that one was really focused on Japan. Something a bit broader, maybe a little bit easier to take in, was to look at 99 nations over 26 years, 1990 to 2015, and whether or not a shift to renewable energy improves social equity outcomes. Some interesting results. So using a survey, as we talked about before, we found out what things were important to people, and here they all are. I'll show them again here. 99 nations means a lot of data to look at, to work out whether or not countries are improving or getting worse. So people wanted environmental improvement. So we use CO2 emissions from the World Bank development indicators due to heat and energy generation. In terms of participation, we're talking about energy access. Do people in rural and urban households have access to energy? Health, again, back to the PM 2.5, morbidity risk, using WHO standards as a cutoff point. The third one, people wanted reduced energy costs. So we wanted to look at the impact of energy costs on poverty levels within the World Development Indicators. And finally, employment. The problem with employment is we can't just say, oh, employment went down, that's great. That's not a real indicator. So we took two composite indicators. One was the employment rate, and we also used GDP growth. So if the employment rate is getting better and GDP is growing, then that's considered a positive. And if something else is happening, we use them as push and pull factors to control for different ideas of full employment in different countries. So I think in Japan, 5% unemployment is considered full employment, but in Australia, it's about 8%. And that's just the nature of the different employment markets. Some people are losing their jobs while some people are gaining others. It's constantly cycling. It's not just a number. The model looks a bit like this. We have people's income distribution on the left-hand axis. We have the amount of new renewable energy as a percentage of energy generation, not capacity, actual electricity delivered to people's homes. And on the right-hand side, we have these social equity factors stacked. Each of these has 100 points. Again, area weighted centroid using a triangle in this case, And as you can see, the idea is that the centroid moves in this direction, more renewable energy, better quality of life. So it should move along this vector. That's what we're hoping to see. The results, here it is. 1990, the first year of our measurement. We measured 26 years. There are 4 groups: high, mid, low, and low, medium, and low income countries. As you can see, in terms of quality of life, which is this axis, compared to renewable energy deployment as a percentage of the total energy in a system, rich nations generally have a better quality of life. No surprises. Yeah, okay. Poor nations generally have a really bad one. But in 1990, the amount of renewable energy is usually below 10% of the total, like almost nothing. It's not a big amount. In fact, the median and the average are shown here. That's probably evidence of that. So what happens 26 years later, this happens. We start to see countries, especially rich countries, moving along that desirable vector. They're moving up and to the right, as you would expect. But what's really interesting is the lower and middle income countries are moving quite radically in lots of directions. You'll see your Denmarks, and I think behind here is Finland or something like that. Countries that have lots of renewable resources tend to be over here. Whereas Japan and Australia are here and, yeah, really close by. So not really impressive in terms of progress, but there's a change. So these are the summaries. These are the averages and the ranges for those countries. What's really interesting is that obviously high income nations are progressing their renewable energy transition, but they're only seeing this moderate shift in social equity improvement between 2 or 3 points. Whereas lower middle income nations only improve their renewable deployment from between maybe 10 and 12%, or maybe even less, 7 to 9%. But they see this relatively large jump up in number of points that they gain in terms of social equity. Low and upper middle income nations only very mildly increase both. This is just a summary. As you can see, the ranges are quite radical. So some countries really get a lot more and some get a lot less. Mapping it, 74 out of 99, so 75% successfully have both. So they get the vector. More renewable energy, better quality of life. That's great. But some don't. In fact, some get less renewable energy and worse social equity. It's this little tiny island here. But the point is, generally speaking, we can say it's not causal, but there is a correlation between increased renewable energy deployment and better quality of life outcomes. Then, of course, it would be irresponsible if we didn't look at some of what's inside that. So we also investigate how income level affects each nation's social outcomes by a factor. So low income nations are really interesting. As you see the amount of new renewable energy deployed, you'll see these spikes align quite nicely. Energy access is improved a lot by that factor. And that's quite nice that those seem to link like that. Upper middle income, we see that health seems to be linked very much with these renewable energy improvements. In terms of lower middle, it's a little bit different. And high income nations, there's this radical change in renewables. But as you can see, the change of other things is not so great. There's a reason for this. All of these things were already at a very high level. We already had 100% energy access. Our health was pretty good. It's very hard to improve something that is already very good. So compared to the initial date, if the factor is 1, only, for example, here, health is improved slightly over time. And that's pretty good. That would reflect well on the fact that we've moved away from coal and oil-fired power to more renewables. That's a good thing. So, interestingly, due to the progress in the renewable energy transition, the social equity gap between rich and poor was reduced. That's really great. So renewable energy seems to be an enabler in terms of shrinking that gap. Perhaps through the increased deployment of renewable and ambitious renewable energy deployment and transition policies, even better outcomes can be derived. I'd love to revisit this and look at what's happened in the last 6 to 7 years. Unfortunately, the World Bank data doesn't update often enough for us to look at it now, but if we could get some third-party data to look at that, I think it would be even more radical, because I think these last 7 years, especially in Japan, and a lot of nations, has seen a lot more renewables, and do those other factors keep up would be super interesting. Look, I think by understanding whether or not this is true, we can start developing policies that fit with that. And yeah, hopefully we can incorporate people's preferences as well to start to develop even better models. Finally, I do put the SDGs up here, not because I love the SDGs, but maybe if we can find out which SDGs people actually want to solve, then we can align some of our policies with those as well. And that would be really good. All right, we're just about at 49 minutes by my count, so I'm going to wrap up relatively quickly, but maybe just a minute or two. So we've got a few things: the energy transition and social equity. Even though the concept of just transition isn't very well known in Japan, at least at the global level, it does appear that a renewable energy or low carbon energy transition does improve social equity. There is some evidence for that. This may be linked to a lack of knowledge of social equity, as at the moment, all we see on TV is carbon neutrality. It hasn't been linked to people just yet. So as I said before, and I'd like you to think about this, as Japan explores concepts like Society 5.0 and the SDGs, maybe these issues will become more prominent. Finally, and I apologize to Jason because he has seen this part before, we, as part of that British Academy Just Transition project, we actually traveled around Japan a little bit, looking at some towns, think Fukushima, those kind of towns that have been heavily affected in the past, and what they're trying to do to rebuild their image. And one of the ones that we visited is Minamata. You guys are aware of Minamata disease? There was organic mercury that was leached into the soil as a result of industry activity in this place called Minamata. And as a result, there was a massive disability. Minamata disease occurred in Kumamoto. And so this town is really trying to reinvent itself. And as a result, they take in appliances from across Japan and give jobs to disabled and disadvantaged people to then break them down and recycle them, which seems quite good. Another place is Omuta, actually in Fukuoka, where I live. And here used to be a very busy coal mining area. The coal mines there are pretty impressive, especially considering that Japan no longer has resources, but certainly in that day, it made that city a very populous place, an incredibly developed place. But today it's kind of fallen off. And so they're trying to reinvent themselves through things like tourism or, chemical industries coming in and doing more unique things. The third one, and maybe more impressive, is Kitakyushu. I do recommend that if you get a chance, either with university or with your lab, to visit Kitakyushu Ecotown is really good because they actually have a hydrogen pipeline. So anyone who's doing hydrogen research, they have 20 kilometers of hydrogen pipeline, austenitic stainless steel, that goes to people's houses. So the people's houses on that pipeline have hydrogen appliances, hydrogen hot water heaters, these kind of things. So you can physically go and see these kind of things and look like, if Japan has a hydrogen economy, this is what it might look like. So I do recommend that one, if you can. Each of these cities has a different challenge. Just like Fukushima, a lot of it is derived from exogenous impacts. They ran out of coal, they had Minamata disease or whatever it was, and they want to reinvent themselves. But I think the big thing that we need to remember is if we're going to proceed the energy transition and improve these social outcomes, sure, it's important to consider technology, it's important to consider systems, but I think the most important part is most definitely the people. The final thing that I want to share, we often say we want a sustainable energy transition, right? And we see this picture. We're told that this is sustainability, but I find this somewhat confusing because although the three circles are there, they say the only part of this that is sustainable is this little bit in the middle. And I think that's often quite confusing. Like, what are we aiming for? We always have to satisfy these three things. I think we can think about that. And the other thing is we need to think about people. So lately we have the SDGs. And yes, they are helpful because they identify individual issues, poverty, gender balance, climate change, clean waterways. It gives us these tangible goals. But I think it might be even easier if we just rethink the way that we line up the three circles for sustainability, that we can start to see why society is critical. And I always teach this to my students. And the third thing that I'd really like you to remember today is that the three circles should be in this order. The first one is the environment, because without the environment, people can't live. That's what we depend on for our life: the air, the water, the trees, all of those things. And so society only makes sense inside the environment. And then what about the economy? Shouldn't the economy be the big one? And a lot of economists should say the economy is the most important. It's not true. Without society, the economy has no meaning. The people are the people who are interested in driving the economy or benefiting from the economy or participating in the economy. So without people, there would be no economy. It wouldn't exist. So I think if we start to look at sustainability in this way, we can start to see at least why people might be more important than we think at first guess. That's all I have for you today. All right. I think these two papers have been handed out, but the third one, the Just Transitions report from the British Academy, is also available online. So if you have a chance,